Hello, book people. PT here to talk about a new book that came out a couple weeks ago, and that is The Fireman by Joe Hill. You might have seen this book around because it is number one on the bestseller list this week, so apparently I'm not alone in having picked it up. But to me, every time Joe Hill puts out a book, which is every couple few years, it's always an event. His books, something about his writing style and the themes of his stories really connect to me, and I always really enjoy his novels. And he's just a great writer. He can turn a phrase, and he tells his stories through very relatable characters. This book is no exception. This book is the story of basically a plague that comes about called dragon scale, where people get these beautiful kind of black and gold marks on their skin is kind of the sign of the infection, and eventually those people burst into flames and they die. So not only do you have people, this sickness running rampant, but you also have these raging fires. So it's kind of like a double whammy upon humanity, and humanity is definitely reeling in this book. Our main character is Harper, who is a nurse, and early on she contracts the disease kind of while trying to work at a hospital to help people who are infected. And she also finds out very early on that she is pregnant. So kind of her goal throughout the book is if she can just live long enough to deliver the baby, there's evidence that the baby might be born healthy, that the disease isn't passed from mother to child. So that's kind of her goal, is can she find a way to survive? And then it's her story of trying to do that. There's a lot to say about this book, a lot of different angles you could take. I really recommend Chris from Reading Roads' video, which I'll put a link to here. He does a great job of really breaking down the story and talking about the interesting idea, which is that in some ways this is like a post-apocalyptic book told from the perspective of the infected, which of course is like the opposite of most that we see. Most of the time we see it from the perspective of the people kind of like trying to survive and not get infected, and maybe even like killing the infected. This is a story from the opposite perspective, but I won't say more about that because Chris does a really good job of talking about that and some of the other important themes. The thing I wanted to talk about this book that I haven't really seen talked about too much elsewhere is the way that this book is kind of really a love letter to I would say the early 80s, late 70s to early 80s era. I remember being a very young kid in the mid 80s, I guess, and hearing about spontaneous combustion. Like, it seemed like that was a much more popular topic of discussion and like speculation than it is today. That was like a popular conspiracy theory thing to talk about back in those days. I remember even going into like the late 80s when I would have been in the early to mid grade school kind of stuff. Spontaneous combustion being like something just talked about. Oh, did you hear that someone in Delaware spontaneously combusted or whatever? And of course, we didn't have the internet then, so it was a little bit harder to fact check your friends when they told you about spontaneous combustion. But there was a case, I did a little research and I found out there was a pretty famous case in the UK in 1980 of possible, basically a guy was found and all that was left of him was his skull, and then his legs like below the knees were perfectly fine, but the rest of him had burned up. And it was a very strange case that they had a really hard time like figuring out what happened to him, and that was like kind of possibly what sparked the popular discussion of spontaneous combustion in the 80s. So you got the theme of that. Also, there's a lot of references to just 80s things. Like there's a song from Dire Straits' Making Movies album that plays a huge role in the story, and that album came out in 1980. Tons of references to The Stand, to the point where this is almost like a riff on The Stand. Like you could almost be like, this is an alternate reality version of The Stand in some ways. There's some of the characters share the same name. There's a deaf character named Nick in this book, just like in The Stand, and some other fun connections that I'm not going to reveal here. The story does take a very different turn than The Stand, but you could see a lot of fun connections and some connections as well to other Stephen King books from the 80s. Also a popular MTV VJ. Do you people younger than me even know what a VJ is? It was the person on MTV who would like introduce the videos, but there was a very popular one called Martha Quinn, who was like one of the bigger VJs throughout the whole 80s. And she, like, the first time she was mentioned in the book, I thought it was just a fun throwaway line. But it turns out, like, her I won't say too much, but Martha Quinn has a role to play in this story, for sure. So I thought it very interesting the way that he played out a lot of those pop culture things from the 80s. And really, if you think about it, post-apocalyptic stuff is very popular today, but it was also very popular then. I think it's seen a resurgence lately, and maybe in like the 90s when the economy was booming and all that stuff, the post-apocalyptic stuff was a little less popular. But if you look at the 80s, not only do you have The Stand, which I guess actually came out in the late 70s, but you also have things like Swan Song, the book Swan Song, which is another huge, epic, post-apocalyptic book, and I'm sure many others. So those are kind of the big two that I can think of. But then if you think of, movies, you've got your Mad Maxes and your Escape from New York City. All those kind of post-apocalyptic stuff were very, very popular. So it's interesting looking at Joe Hill. That would have been like his young kid days. So it's interesting to see him kind of like reflect back on those and put a modern spin on some of those ideas from the 80s. So that's really what I wanted to add to the conversation about the Fireman. There's a ton of great videos about it out there and a ton of great reviews. Like I said, make sure you check out Chris's, and I recommend reading the book. Joe Hill is definitely in, I'd say, the top 5 of my favorite authors. Every time he puts out a book, I will definitely read it. I'll put a couple other reviews here as well. Here I've got my review of the Book of Strange New Things, and then over here I'll put my discussion of some multiple Stephen King's works called Hope is Stephen King's Secret Weapon. So check those videos out. If you're not subscribed already, please do so. Thanks so much for watching. I will talk to you next time. Bye.